We all knew what to paint. Bread, work, vote. But the message was workers of the world, unite. Everyone was going to have equal rights, and that included the artists.
Comrades, we are passing through one of the most critical, the most important moments of history. A moment when the world's socialist revolution is in the making. We need to mobilize the masses to progress fast. Art is the most powerful means of political propaganda for the triumph of the socialist cause.
We are breaking with the past because we cannot accept its hypotheses. We ourselves are creating our own hypotheses, and only on them, as in our own inventions, can we build a new life and a new world view. More than anyone else, the artist knows this intuitively and believes in it absolutely. That is exactly why artists, above all, undertook a revolution.
My search for the new art for a new world started here in St. Petersburg, where for centuries the vast Russian Empire had been controlled from the Winter Palace by the Tsars, who believed they had the divine right to rule with no elected government. They enjoyed a privileged life, while 80% of Russians were peasants. Despite the abolition of serfdom in 1861, they still had no rights. So in the early 1900s, the peasants flooded into the cities from all over the empire, desperately seeking work. They formed the proletariat and united with a revolutionary approach to politics and to art. For over a decade, and through the First World War, discontent had been growing against Tsar Nicholas II. After the mass riots at the Women's Day March of February 1917, the Tsar was forced to abdicate and power ceded to the provisional government. But despite this, the voiceless people grew angrier. So how did the artists respond? In July 17, photographer Victor Buller stood here at his studio window and took one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. As the government troops opened fire on the crowd at a demonstration below. In this street, on that day, hundreds were injured and dozens lay dead. With tensions rising, the Bolshevik Party was gaining in popularity, and in October, the awaiting crowd hailed the return of their exiled leader.
Comrades, with all my might I urge you to realize that everything now hangs by a thread. We must not wait. We may lose everything. The government is tottering. It must be given the death blow at all costs.
Many young artists were at the vanguard of the movement and joined the optimistic crowds on the streets, looking forward to a new utopia.
They were all revolutionaries. They fought at the barricades, fighting for the revolution. For them, the revolution was a breakthrough into the new world from the old world, which they were fed up with. That was the ambition of the young people. They were then 18 to 20 years old. Naturally, they were striving ahead.
Finally, the Bolsheviks closed in on the headquarters of the provisional government, the Tsar's Winter Palace.
The whole revolution was planned at the example of the French Revolution. So there was a storming of Bastille, so you have to, and storming of Tuileries, so you had to storm Winter Palace. So it was partly performance, and then it was made a performance. The famous film of Eisenstein, October, which shows the storming of the Winter Palace, is an absolute lie.
Russia's pioneering film director, Sergei Eisenstein, would portray the version of events the Bolsheviks wanted remembered. His masterpiece, October, which has influenced filmmakers ever since, depicts the armed masses heroically streaming into the Winter Palace.
Nothing of this time ever happened. There was no storming, only some very few armed people who just got in and arrested the provisional government. It was peaceful. The Winter Palace was taken by the revolutionaries without big fight. And they have been cutting the portraits of the Tsars, which have been hanging in some of the places. This was most of the damage what happened in the Winter Palace.
With the Bolsheviks now in power, and Tsar Nicholas under house arrest in the Ural Mountains, the court photographer Boason captures here an aristocratic era now at an end. The entire family were later executed by a firing squad and thrown down a mine shaft. In 1918, the capital was moved to Moscow. Successive layers of history have buried this extraordinary period of turmoil. To find out more about the life and death survival of the great avant-garde artists, I wanted to delve beneath the anonymous face of the metropolis, go into the archives and meet surviving descendants, many of whom are working artists in Russia today. Why don't you just start off by telling me who was your great-grandfather?
My great-grandfather was an artist who lived in Moscow during the period of revolution.
Fedor told me that his great-grandfather worked right here in this Moscow apartment 100 years ago.
From the open windows he heard the church bells, which inspired him to create his architectural pictures. Lentulov loved very much Russian architecture, but especially at the time of revolution, and he depicted crowds of moving people on background of old Moscow churches.
Long before 1917, a huge artistic revolution was already well underway. But it took the famous political events to unlock the massive outpouring of creativity in all fields of art.
From 1900 or 1902 or 1903 up to 1915, Russian art became, I would say, the most avant-garde in the whole of the world.
A giant in the avant-garde was Kazimir Malevich. His anarchistic attitude coincided perfectly with the Bolsheviks and their promise of political change.
Malevich, he's working on the theory of suprematism in Vitebsk. There were a group of people connected with Malevich, and he was a crazy man with his idea of suprematism.
I have broken the blue boundary of color limits, come out into the white. Besides me, comrade pilots swim in this infinity. I have established the semaphore of suprematism. I have beaten the lining of the colored sky, torn it away, and in the sack that formed itself, I have put color and knotted it. Swim. The free white sea lies before you.
The new step he did is trying to show ideas, not to show existing reality. His art is not about reality. He's very idealistic. The way world can be structured. And this obviously comes from the cosmos.
I mean, there are certain pieces that were wonderful, certain pieces were completely absurd. And they're still absurd, but they're considered as a masterpieces, but they're absurd. Like Black Square, I think is absurd.
So can you explain to me what is the Black Square all about?
Well, Malevich had, of course, painted the Black Square in the summer of 1915 and exhibited it at the end of 1915. And he placed his Black Square in the corners of the room, across the corners of the room, in the position that an icon would have occupied in a Russian domestic interior. So he was imbuing his Black Square with the metaphysical and spiritual connotations of the icon.
Religion is opium for the people. Religion is a sort of spiritual booze in which the slaves of capital drown their human image, their demand for a life more or less worthy of man. The yoke of religion that weighs upon mankind is merely a product and reflection of the economic yoke within society.
The mass movement of denying God or church by the young generation was extremely strong. As Dostoevsky said, if God, there is no God, everything is allowed. You can do everything if there is no God. So that was the basis of Russian revolution. There were very young people that accepted the revolution immediately, and they fought White Guard, they fought church, they fought everything, trying to, first of all, destroy the old without thinking what they're going to build instead.
The Black Square is the end of the world and the beginning of a new world. Like the big deluge, the big end. It's the symbol of the new beginning, and to begin something anew, you need to end everything that was before, but everything. And that's the Black Square.
The communist ban on religion would result in the systematic destruction of architectural symbols of worship. They chose Russia's most prominent cathedral of Christ the Saviour in Moscow and reduced it to rubble.